there is no way that those countries will actually get that money to put into circulation into their economy, because no one actually has the incentive to give them the loan. The reason why Greece is not getting the loans is not that we are using austerity measures as a criteria. The reason why they will never get the loan anymore is because there is no way that they can ever pay it back, and anyone who has the capacity to give the loan has the incentive to get the money back, and if they see that this will never happen, then they will not give that loan. Now, secondly, about the investors. Now, firstly, okay, I'm going to make a few points of rebuttal, moving on to my own constructive, which is about sustainability. So firstly, about investors. We see that investors go to places where there is low risk.
What a point,
no, thank you. Under proposition plan, we get those Apple companies who are just there for the purchasing power. Under our model, we get the investors who are there because of the low risk, those who actually give us more jobs and help us out of the slum. Thirdly, about those people who will be on the street because all their benefits are cut. We are never going to cut benefits so much that people are unable to live their lives normally. We might lower them to a point where they have the normal living conditions, not luxury, but we still don't. We're not going to put people on the streets. This is not what we're doing. Also about the crime rate is not because of austerity, crime rate is because of the slump, and we, under our model, are actually helping the countries out of the slump, unlike the proposition who is just creating a bubble that will eventually burst. Fourthly, about the extremists, well, right now in UK we have UKIP, who is constantly saying that the government is spending in the wrong way, what they're doing is wrong, that we will always have extremist parties who are always opposing power, just like we have right now in different places, depending on what the government is doing, either spending a lot or doing austerity. The extremist parties will always oppose the power, and there is no way that this can go to the opposition side. And now moving on to my constructive about sustainability. Now, the reason why the proposition plan is in no way sustainable in a second is because the way to get out of the recession, you need to get your GDP up, and for that they are increasing government spending, which is not sustainable, which we'll explain after taking that POI. Yes.
Madam, when Greece implemented austerity measures, it actually hampered their trade and also destroyed any form of infrastructure that they use for trade. And hence, even the special economic zones were destroyed as well. So it actually deters investors away on your side.
We are not destroying the infrastructure, we are not scaring the investors away. How we will get those investors is to bring an example of Estonia, which did use austerity measures. What happened in Estonia was, at the boom, there were really high wages for people, which made export really expensive, which made other countries import from Estonia less. Therefore, if we lower the wages, then the investors will see a lower risk for first reason, and secondly, they will see how if they invest into this country, if they put their company there, then their products will actually be exported. Therefore, the country can actually come out of the slum, and the investors are motivated to come. Now, to get the GDP up for a country, the proposition is proposing to increase government spending. What that means is that people need to do it with a loan or some other external money because they don't have it for their own, otherwise it will be a recession. Now, what it ends up with is that about 200% of your GDP is your loan, and you are not able to pay it back. You can't keep taking loans forever. That is the reason why the bubble will eventually burst. This plan is simply not sustainable. So what will happen when the bubble bursts and the country is not able to pay back, and no one will help them out because there's no one motivated to give them money? Then the country might have the necessity to default. What happens when a country defaults is that it is bad for all those countries who have given a loan, all those agents who have given a loan for that country, start getting it back. Second, it is bad for the people living in that country because all their life conditions will be even worse. Like the proposition is claiming that under austerity measures, life will be bad because we are cutting benefits. While in reality, if the country is in such a big slump that it needs external help and is unable to get it and defaults, the country's people, the people of the country will be living in even worse conditions. Now, there is no money coming into that country because all they have is taxes. It's clearly not enough. Otherwise, they could pay it back. There will be no support. There will be no more investments because then it is not a sustainable place at all. Whilst under our model, we still have we could get back into competition, as we have explained in our speeches, that if a country has if the workforce is less expensive, if the wages are lower, then then all the export or produce that could be exported is also less expensive, thus appealing to other countries. Thus they will become more competitive. Thus will come out of the slum. Now, if we don't use austerity measures, if we go with the proposition model, yes.
Under the harsh austerity measures imposed on Greece actually threatened to leave the Eurozone, which actually shows how austerity measures can actually destroy the whole of the European Union.
We're in no place of saying that what Greece is doing is right. Even if Greece left Eurozone, there would be no way of them getting out of the slum. The austerity is a way for getting out of the slum, but the proposition plan is just not helping at all. It might be uncomfortable, but still it is necessary to change anything. Now, if we go with the proposition model, then people are in no way motivated to support any reforms. Whilst if we had in early 2000s during the .com, then Germany did lots of reforms that people were supporting because they knew that this would get them out of the slum. They never got into a horrible situation. That is what helped them out. Whilst if under the proposition model we'll just keep on spending, and the people will never see that something is wrong. Therefore, people will not be incentivized to support any reforms because why fix it when it's not broken? We need the people to give some value into the state. Therefore, we need them to be productive. We need them to support reforms if necessary. And for all those reasons, since the proposition plan is clearly not sustainable, we see that you should vote opposition. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds.
The problem with side of opposition was they thought that by implementing austerity, despite the fact that there's severe short-term economic harms on the people, the long-term would suddenly be magical and miraculously solve everything. And this is something I'm going to break right at the start of my speech. But I'm going to show you this in 2 clashes, why austerity is bad for the economy of the country and why it's bad for the social cohesion of the country. So on the first clash, on why it's bad for the economy of the country. And here they try to tell us that right now, these European economies were living beyond their means. And right now we're going to implement long-term structural reforms, so that means more MNCs will come and invest and they'll set up factories and so on and so forth. And notice that the shining example was Greece, right? But you cannot keep using Greece as the example. Why? Because there are other countries such as Ireland and Spain, where the government was not responsible for the crisis, but it's actually irresponsible behavior on part of the banks. For example, in Ireland, the government actually had to bail out the banks, and that is why it slammed into huge fiscal budget deficits. But even if you go with that Greece example, right, let me tell you why it's bad. Because if you actually harm the economy in the short term, all your long-term structural reforms also will have no effect. Let me give you an example. In Greece, when you cut down the education budget, as they did, by 25% and close down 2,000 schools, you have a less educated workforce. Therefore, in the long term, when you have a less educated workforce, MNCs are less incentivized to come into your country and set up operations in the long term because you have a less educated workforce. In Latvia, when you implement austerity measures, people are more incentivized to leave the country in search of better job opportunities and better economic opportunities. When your economy is shrinking and when your workforce is shrinking, MNCs in the long term are less incentivized to invest in your country and set up operations within your country. Why? Because your consumer market has shrunk so much. Therefore, if you harm the economy in the short term, all of the long-term structural reforms they want to talk about will have no effect at all. But even if we agree, even if I agree, that yes, these long-term structural reforms does have some effect, in the process, they're still harming an entire generation of people simply to get your long-term structural reforms, right? Look at Spain, where 53.5% of Spanish youth are unemployed despite putting so much work into getting their degree. In Greece, when 15,000 civil servants are unemployed despite having done no wrong, you're harming all of these people, you're harming all of their families. And even worse, right now in places such as Greece, where people are not buying into the austerity packages, where they do not believe in the austerity packages, that is when the government will not also believe in austerity packages, they'll keep reverting back to fiscal and monetary stimulus. So therefore, if you impose the austerity packages on the country, they will not buy into it, they will never actually go through with it. Why? Because they themselves do not believe with it. So therefore, all the long-term structural reforms that they want to talk about will simply not take place if you harm the economy in the short term and if you impose this on the people itself. Then they also told us in their third substantive, this whole idea that now the economy is unsustainable. But let's look at their line of logic, right? They're saying that right now the wages of the people are too high. We want to lower the wages so that we can boost exports. So what they essentially want to do right now, right, is that they want to create this cheap labor force incentivizing MNCs to come in and invest in the country. They want to tell a poor guy that I do not care, you cannot earn more than a certain amount of wage. Why? Because we want to boost exports. And you're going to make sure that the guy remains poor, you're going to make sure that the guy's wages remain low. And you know what's the last country that did this? China. They're the ones who created this cheap labor force, and the people there are suffering because they're continuously exploited by these MNCs because their wages are depressed. And this is something that they stand for. Then they also told us, okay, look, our plan is unsustainable because if we keep borrowing, we're creating a bubble, the debts keep mounting, and things like that, right? But what I'm telling you right now is that under our side, you're actually better able to pay off your debts. Why? Because if you do things such as fiscal stimulus, your economy grows. More MNCs are invested to come in and invest in the country. Are taking a more investors are coming to setting up operations within your country. But before I move on, yes, sir.
Okay, so boosting the GDP by just putting more money into it, but not making it sustainable because you can just like raise it with public sector spending or whatever.
Thank you, sir. I understood. Thank you, sir. I understood. He's saying is what I understand what you're saying. You're saying that okay, we're just going to boost the GDP and we're not going to implement these long-term structural reforms. But what your side is doing is that you're going to depress the GDP, and this is a cycle, right? Because your economy keeps shrinking. When your economy is shrinking, your debts keep increasing. The debt to GDP ratio keeps increasing, and therefore you're not really able to pay off your debts when the economy is shrinking. When you're implementing austerity measures, right? What I'm telling you is when you expand the economy, that is when you're better able to pay off these debts because more investors are coming into your country because they see that people are spending again. The political and social situation is not so volatile anymore. They'll set up operations, and that's when you're better able to pay off your debts. Then we also told you, right from my first substantive, this whole idea that under austerity measures, that you're denying citizens of vital services. What was their only response to this? Don't worry, social services are the last to be cut. But no, they're actually the first thing to be cut. Why? Because when you impose austerity measures on the government, the easiest things for governments to cut is things such as welfare benefits and pensions. Because that is things that's under their control, right? The easiest thing for them to do is lay off poor civil servants, right? And even then, they also agree that yes, these things are cut, but the effect on the low-income group is minimal. But that is not really true, right? Because when you're poor, even a 10% cut in your welfare benefits still harms you immensely, right? So even if we agree that the impact on them is minimal, even if you cut it by 10%, the impact on these low-income groups is still huge because they're poor. And this is something we simply cannot stand for. Then they kept asking us a simple question. The ECB will stop loaning Greece money if they abandon austerity measures. We have a few responses to this, right? Because on the practical level, the ECB will not stop loaning Greece money. Why? Because as my second speaker already showed you, if Greece defaults, there will be systemic consequences for the rest of the Eurozone. For example, fear will set into the financial markets. Investors will think, okay, Greece defaulted, maybe Spain and Portugal will also default, and therefore I better pull my money out of Spain and Portugal. And this means that Spain will collapse, Portugal will collapse. This will lead to a domino effect that will extend all the way. And this will lead to a damaging the entire economy of the European Union. Therefore, even if Greece abandons austerity measures, the ECB will not be happy about it, but they'll still loan Greece money because they do not want to incur in the process themselves. And that is why they will still have money. And we also told you that if you actually abandon austerity measures, more investors are going to come in and buy your bonds and sovereign bonds and things like that, and therefore you will still have the money to do your fiscal stimulus. And then we also showed you, right from our second substantive, this whole idea about capital flight, right? If you implement austerity measures, investors will pull their money out of the economy. What was their only response? Don't worry, investors will not leave because the government is repairing the economy. But what is really happening here? When you implement austerity measures, your welfare benefits are cut, people are unemployed, their income levels are decreasing. Nobody is spending. So why should investors come in and set up their businesses in a place where nobody is spending, where they cannot earn profits? Even worse, the political and social situation in the country is volatile when you implement austerity measures, something I've shown you right from our first two speakers. Therefore now investors are scared. If I invest in this country, my investment will be lost, maybe because the political and social situation is so volatile. And that's exactly what's happening in Greece, where $80 billion has been pulled out of Greece banks simply because Greece implemented austerity. Then we also told you from our fourth substantive, this whole idea of harming regional trade, something we should completely drop, something we should never tackle, because countries do not want to trade with you if you implement austerity measures. And they also said there's no incentive for reforms on our side, but there actually is incentive for reforms. Why? Because a slump happened, people do not want to live through another Eurozone crisis, therefore there will be societal pressure on the government to ensure that they do not do things like unsustainable spending and spending on vanity projects again. Second question to this house, which side is actually better for the social cohesion of the country? And here we told you in our last substantive, this whole idea about harming regional relations, how people are angry at Germany because they're imposing austerity measures on the country. Again, completely dropped by their side. And what does this mean? There's reduced cooperation between these countries on important issues that affect the entire international community, things such as transnational terrorism and things like that, simply because Germany is implementing these austerity measures on Greece, something they never tackled. Then we also told you in our third substantive, the whole idea about rise of far-right parties. They said, oh don't worry, far-right parties will oppose the government no matter what, right? But when conditions are poor, when people are poor and income levels are decreasing, that is when it's easier for these far-right parties to gain support. On the comparative, when the governments are spending, their welfare benefits are intact, that is when it's harder for the far-right parties to come out and say, oh look, the government is doing wrong. Why? Because the economic conditions in the country is still prosperous, it's harder for the far-right parties to gain support. Because I've shown you why we're best for the economy in the short term and long term, and why we're best for the social cohesion of the country, go with such cohesion.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
Today, great economies like Greece's, Spain's and Portugal's are in the drench, simply because they don't have a productive enough of an economy to save themselves. This is what we will actually change with austerity, and what the proposition doesn't seem to understand. I'm going to summarize this debate in 3 points. I'm going to talk about why we need austerity in order to create these reforms to actually boost our economy. Secondly, then, why austerity is actually a good economic policy. And third of all, I'm going to answer to all of these social mishaps. So, but first of all, we need to clear up why are austerity measures actually used. Austerity measures aren't thought of after or before these loans were made. They were thought of because it's economically wise to use them. They see that the Troika or the European Central Bank or IMF, they see that this is a policy that will actually work in the long term for these kind of economies. because they're not at the moment productive enough. They can't actually sustain these kinds of benefits that they're living on, or sustain those kinds of wages that they have. So they need to use these things in order to actually get them out of the slump. This is why those austerity measures need to be implemented, and this is why Troika actually enforces them. They are not because Troika likes them that much and they just have emotional thank you. Okay, so moving on to why actually we need austerity to make these social reforms or structural reforms. So when people are constantly living in a bubble, they see that I'm earning so much money right now, I'm getting all of these benefits, I'm being paid for the 13th and the 14th month, and I can work as little as I want to and I still will get all the benefits. This will show the people that, I'm actually doing really well, and the economy is, well, I don't really care because, I have this purchasing power, I have this iPhone in my hand, no thank you, and I don't actually need to worry about anything. But at the same time though, what actually is happening with the economy is that it isn't doing well, it isn't sustainable. Because the economy, no thank you, because the country isn't actually exporting enough, it isn't collecting enough revenue from taxes, like Greece didn't tax tourism, which is one of the biggest foreign currency earners, pretty much like 40% of the GDP. So if they can't actually get that kind of a tax revenue, and when they lose more than 150 billion euros in a 10-year time, then this kind of seems kind of irrational not to do these things. But at the same time, people don't see how, people don't see how we are actually in a debt, because you constantly keep borrowing more. They don't see that they need to make a change, because why fix it if it's not broken? What actually austerity shows them is that our economy is not sustainable and we need to make these reforms. And these reforms are desperately necessary in order to actually boost the economy. So from this point on, moving to how actually austerity boosts the economy in the long term. And this is the thing, it actually does it for the long term. It might have some, thank you. We are not saying that it might not have some mishaps when it starts to be implemented. Because what austerity needs to start working is when it starts actually going. Because first of all, what needs to happen is we need to cut all of these immense benefits and immense budgets that the country at the moment has. It needs to cut it needs to cut the high wages that aren't sustainable because they are not actually exporting, or they are not actually doing anything in order to justify those. They're just sitting around and collecting their paychecks. So what actually austerity does in this case, by lowering wages and increasing taxes, is that we're really glad that the proposition on this side actually agrees with us. Because in my POI, when I asked them what kind of investors would you like more, are the ones that, no thank you, are the ones that who have the Apple store, or who are the ones that are creating like firms or production. Then they say that they want the production ones because those are the ones that bring the jobs. Well, this is what actually happens with austerity. Because if you have lowered wages and if you have a lower buying cost, no thank you, then those are the investors that will come. With their kind of a bubble, if people have more purchasing power, then they will get the Apple store. They will sell their iPhones, but they won't actually contribute much to society. Because actually what these companies that are putting their factories into these companies will do is that they will, first of all, they will bring outside capital. No thank you. They will bring outside capital to that country. So they will build up a factory, they will hire people. What these people will do is they work for the money and take the money to the next store, the factory, whatever. Then they will enrich the people that are working there. What in turn that will do is that the people who are working there, they can actually buy produce from the farmers that are growing the food. No, thank you. So you can see how this kind of a circle will actually boost the economy as a whole, not only boost the economy of an Apple production company. They won't only actually get the iPhones, but they will actually give more people the ability to get more money in the circulation. This is what actually austerity does, and this is not possible without it, because the wages are so high that the companies can't compete with other ones. This is why austerity actually boosts the economy in the longer term and makes them more sustainable, because now you bring in outside capital, not that you just like, no thank you, you just keep boosting the economy as a, fancy. So, but before I move on to the third point, I will take a POI. And this, therefore, actually the austerity will boost the economy. And enriching everyone in the society. So, talking about the social disparities. So, what will happen, of course, is when you're accustomed to living with 2,000 euros a month pension, and now it's being cut to a more reasonable 500 euro one, or 400 or 300 euro one, then you're going to be outraged. Go.
So when Spain implemented austerity measures to cut all the public hospitals, why do you punish the people just to teach them that the economy is
Okay, so when they actually maybe close them down, then they might privatize them to make them more competitive. So they actually would offer better care for a better price than the government could ever do. This is the thing that actually needs to be done, because then the services are more beneficial and more effective than the government could ever do. So, talking about the social disparities then. The thing is that, of course, some people might, like as I said before, if you had a 2,000 euro pension and now you have 300 euro one, then you're going to be outraged. You're going to be, well, I can't afford this iPhone 6 now because I simply don't have the money. But in the same sense, you don't actually need the iPhone 6. The governments will still keep the basic human necessities in order for the people to survive. This is not what will happen to China. Europe will not turn into the new China, because we still have basic human rights. We are saying that this is actually what we are not going to turn into this, and this is just ridiculous. But at the same time, what will happen though is that when people are just sustaining themselves and they're keeping their jobs, they will actually feel like they are giving more back to the state. And this is what they started pointing out as, well, the far-right parties will rise, but at the same time the far-right parties will, or the extremist parties or whatever, they will always oppose the government no matter what they do. This plan doesn't aggravate it, and it's justified because of the economy that we will get is more sustainable, more beneficial for everyone in the longer term. This is how we bring them out from the slum. This is how we fix Europe as a whole. So if you want to fix Europe, you failure to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, under the proposition model, the government is like a little child who has blown a chewing gum bubble, which is fun to watch to grow the bubble, but eventually it bursts and it leaves sticky bubble gum all over the child's face, which is kind of disgusting and uncomfortable. What the government is now trying to do is blow a new bubble out of the remaining bubble gum on the child's face. What we are trying to do is to scrape that bubble gum together and get it off the child's face, because it's kind of disgusting. Now, the big question here is who actually gets the economy out of the slump? So, under the proposition side, they are somehow magically getting a lot of money to put into circulation, and people will get a lot of purchasing power, and they're really happy because they have a lot of money. We still don't see where the money is really coming from, because we don't see any realistic ways of that external support of money. Now, secondly, they claim that they will get those investors who put a lot of effort into the economy. We don't see those useful investors coming. We see the Apple stores coming. We see the not so clever investors coming. Whilst under the opposition model, there will be investors who see low risk and will actually put something back into that economy. They will give those jobs. jobs for those people who are then able to be a part of getting the economy out of the slum, because then the country becomes more competitive and actually able to be on the markets and be competitive on the markets. So therefore, our plan or our model, the austerity, is much more sufficient and actually helps the economy out of the slum. Now, what will happen in long term is that under the proposition model, it's really fun because in short term, because we have a lot of money in our country, and it is a very short-term plan. Whilst in long term, they will have much more problems because they're not helping the economy, they're not fixing it, they are just creating a vision that it is good by putting a lot of money into it, whilst it is just a bubble that will eventually burst. So eventually, those people who they are protecting so much with their benefits will suffer more, whilst they could just suffer a bit right now and eventually have, in reality, a better life, just like in Germany, which they also brought as an example, whilst actually in Germany they did those reforms and got a better life in the end, which we also have mentioned. We think our model is much more sustainable because the austerity might be uncomfortable for the period of time that the economy is in a slump, but it actually gets the economy still going, and gets the real economic growth, whilst the proposition model gets a short-term vision of having an economic growth, while it actually doesn't have that, it just has a bubble that will burst, and therefore our model is much more sustainable, much better in the long term, much better for the country itself in the end. So these are excellent reasons to oppose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 3 minutes and 54 seconds.
We now invite the reply speaker by the proposition to close the debate.
Grounded it in reality for you from the very start. We told you that countries with austerity have already seen people become severely harmed. We gave you the example of Portugal, Latvia, and Spain, and how the education, healthcare, and other services were all cut. And we explained to you how in the very first place, what they pushed for long-term governmental reforms, won't even happen in the first place, because the short-term harms that are incurred by austerity, such as the cutting of essential services, will be too impactful to society and such a negative consequence that the long-term sustainability won't even be assured, because the economy and their people can't even come back from the economic slump that they were put under because of austerity measures. So mainly today, we have two main points of clash. Firstly, on who improves the long-term economy of the country, the long-term sustainability for the country, both economically and for the individual, and secondly, on who better protects the people on the ground. So firstly, on who improves the long-term aspect for the countries itself. Now they told us that for economic reform, on the point of economic reform, we told you that happens better on our side, because we allow for natural incentives to take place, in which we allow countries themselves to act on these situations themselves and implement some policies or measures that will help them, whereas on their side, they solely rely on external organizations pushing them. Therefore, there's no actual change in the mindset, and we told you that from the very start. This is what austerity measures entail, which is from external organizations putting for some sort of setups or measures that are supposed to be carried out in your countries. Therefore, it's easier for them to fall back into the crisis in the very first place, because you didn't actually incentivize a natural reform, an organic change in the country, where they actually invoke themselves to properly change the economic systems in the country themselves. Therefore, because it was an external from for circulation in the economy. We told you from the very first speaker that these European Commission banks, for example, will be the ones that will be incentivized to help out. People in the Eurozone will be incentivized to help out because of the very aspect we showed you how because of their own incentives they have and to guard their own incentives and their own priorities, they will be incentivized to push money into helping these countries come out of the economic slums in the very first place. They gave us the idea about attracting foreign companies, but we showed you on our side we better do this because we attract them in the very first place, because we provide them with an economy that they can thrive and profit under, because the people are willing to spend and the people are able to give back profits to the companies that come in to invest in the country. Whereas on their side, no one is very willing from the very start, no company is willing to come in, and this is further exacerbated on the very fact because of their short-term harms, such as cutting down on educational work, education or infrastructure in the very first place. Because these harms are so impactful onto the company, onto the people, because there's no more educated workforce, for example, no company would even want to come from the very start, and even in the future, because education and healthcare was cut down from the very start of their policy. So the second point on who better protects the people on the ground, we showed you that who really allows them the means to defend themselves. We showed you with austerity. They showed us with austerity on their side, with no jobs, no income, they revert back to crime. They have no means of helping themselves out of the situation. We gave you the concrete example of how it happened in Latvia with the increased crime rates because the very aspect with austerity measures, people had no other means to get a proper income to sustain themselves, therefore relying on crimes. The second thing on essential services, they didn't hit us directly on the point, only cutting it down and saying, you know what, they won't cut essential services, although we gave you tangible, concrete examples on Portugal, Latvia, and Spain. Therefore, we showed you how because these short-terms are so impactful, long-term reform won't even occur on their side. Therefore, because austerity only impairs society, and the most weakest and vulnerable in society, we would abandon it.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds.